You, Dr. Bosey. Next up, we have Dr. James Hill, Associate Professor of History at the University of Pittsburgh. He's the author of Creek Internationalism in an Age of Revolution, which came out in 2022 and focuses on Creek and Seminole efforts to defend their territorial and political power by forging transatlantic diplomatic networks, manipulating and appropriating European concepts of sovereignty, and participating in an international diplomatic community. Brought along a little show and tell also for you. His current project explores Native societies that contended with trusteeships and guardianships during the early republic. He has also worked on Florida History Online, which incidentally I robbed blind earlier this morning, to publish a series of transcripts documenting Florida Native history, including letters and documents associated with both Cowkeeper and Long Warrior. His talk this morning will focus on Cowkeeper and Long Warrior. Fitting. Welcome.
All right, good morning, everybody. So you'll notice a lot of names, a lot of episodes, a lot of incidents reoccurring here. All of our previous presenters have covered on a lot of figures and events that I will be covering as well. So the impetus, as you all know, behind this talk is the passage or the several passages of Bartram's travels that refer to the Long Warrior and the Cowkeeper during his 1774 voyages in Florida. Bartram was escorted by a trader named Charles McGlatchy, who worked at Spalding and Company's stores on the St. Johns River. So I actually have an image I'll skip right to showing. There's an aerial shot of the modern day of the area where the lower store was. This was kind of his envoy to meeting both Long Warrior and Cowkeeper. And in tow with McGlatchy, he traveled to Tuscola, toward the Alachua Prairie, met with several Alachua leaders, and obtained a first-hand look at how tense diplomatic and trade negotiations took place between British colonists and members of the Alachua community. Bartram did his best to relate these encounters in detail and to reveal all he could about how these communities functioned. Though he presented their customs and rituals as exoticisms at times, and got a few things wrong, his resources, his writings are much richer and much more detailed than others of his contemporaries, and they proved an invaluable resource for generations of scholars. And what I hope to do here is contextualize two of these figures that kind of have emerged as prominent individuals in Bartram's writings, Long Warrior and Cowkeeper, illuminate a bit more about the context of their lives and their roles in this region and in Florida history throughout the mid to late 18th century. Documentary research and ethnohistorical analysis have provided scholars with tools to examine these noteworthy individuals in greater detail. We can place Cowkeeper and Long Warrior within the context of their world and in their society, and in turn explore what they can tell us about the native communities of late 18th century Florida. First, I'll start with the Cowkeeper, who is not the individual pictured here. Alternatively known by various names, Ahaya, which would have been his name that he would have been known by in his community. Vacapuchase, which is kind of a Spanish turn Muskogee term that essentially is meaning Cowkeeper. He's the man, of course, who bestowed the name Pupugi, meaning flower hunter, on William Bartram. And he and other people in his community were, of course, curiously piqued by Bartram's interest in collecting flower species. The Cowkeeper was the Micco, or the headman of the Alachuas. His people were Oconee, as a couple of previous speakers had mentioned, and they came into Florida in the mid-1700s. Cowkeeper, of course, was part of the raiding parties that would attack mission communities in the Panhandle in particular, those Appalachian and Yamasee communities especially. And that was kind of the first part of their forays into Florida in the early to mid 1700s, 1730s, 1740s. And from there, Cowkeeper eventually decides to make Florida his home. Moving down to the Alachua prairies sometime in the mid 1700s, probably late 1740s, early 1750s. So Cowkeeper's band of Oconee people, and it's important to note that not all of the people of the Oconee town migrate to the Alachua prairie. were basically seeking greater autonomy. They were seeking a place where they would not be hemmed in by other communities along the Chattahoochee River. And this is where it's important to kind of talk a little bit more at length about Native communities in general, not just those in Florida, but also those further north that are part of the so-called Creek Confederacy or Creek Nation. These were village-based peoples. They basically were rooted in the fundamental unit of the town, right? Who at times consolidated together in pursuit of various diplomatic and political goals, but very much at their foundation were localized, right? And they each kind of governed themselves and pursued various agendas that were based upon these localities, these towns, these individual units. Talwas would be the word in Muskogee for a tribal town. These were the most prominent communities in this milieu, right? So the Alachuas, and especially those in Cowkeeper's town of Cuscowella, were a multi-ethnic polyglot community. Some of them were, like Cowkeeper, were people who had migrated from the Creek communities. Others were indigenous Floridians with even deeper roots in the area, right? But also the Creek towns, to the further to the north on the Chattahoochee River, on the Flint River, on the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers, those were all polyglot communities too. There are various nations, the Alabamas, the Natchez, the Yamasee, the Yuchi, as well as Muskogee and Hitchiti-speaking communities, all made up this milieu of what we, and based on what the British called them, now refer to as the Creeks or the Muskogee Creek Nation. So Cowkeeper was basically an individual who did what many other individuals from Creek country did. They found in Florida a land that provided a lot of opportunities for greater autonomy, but also material resources that helped them thrive. And so a little bit of what I'm going to talk about in terms of Cowkeeper and Long Warrior's story centers upon this pursuit of opportunity. So Cowkeeper's people already knew the Alachua Prairie well, right? And a lot of this is based upon the years of hunting and warfare that went on when the Oconees, along with other Creek peoples, came into the Panhandle and further south, taking captives, raiding Appalachian communities, raiding Yamasee communities, and other indigenous Florida communities. They'd familiarize themselves with the resources and the environment of the Alachua Prairie. And by the time Bartram arrived, they had really planted roots in the area, and they had built a flourishing community at Cuscowella. And Cowkeeper's eminence in this community is very apparent, looking at the passages that Bartram uses to describe him. He describes Cowkeeper as being surrounded by a coterie of, quote, ancient men, residing in a house of, quote, superior magnitude, which bore a large flag. So obviously, very prominent individual, right? His power is kind of embedded in the human geography of his settlement. There also, of course, is the episode where Bartram notes the retinue of enslaved Yamasees that are residing in Cowkeeper's household, which Dr. Bossi describes so eloquently. Now, Bartram, when he describes Cowkeeper, makes clear that this is a prominent, powerful individual, even though at times he maybe leans into some noble savage tropes, referring to his manly and placid yet ferocious countenance. And so Bartram really kind of is playing into a little bit of what his audience expects to see in a powerful native figure, someone who is at once noble and stately, but also a fierce, ferocious warrior, right? And as we know, part of the Oconees' claims to the area of Alachua are based on that reputation of conquest, right? So Cowkeeper might not wanted to have dissuaded Bartram from, picking up on this warrior element of his personality, right? A figure of Cowkeeper's esteem took part in and had great success in raids, such as those described earlier, during his younger days. But it's also important to note, with regard to reference to the enslaved Yamasees, that this was not an Anglo-American plantation, right? Slavery was very different in Muskogee communities and in indigenous communities in Florida in general, right? So Bartram really emphasizes the abject fear that he supposedly saw in the countenance of these Yamasees, right? But it's important to note that these weren't people who were just living a totally servile, docile existence, the way that British Americans, Anglo-Americans in general, like to describe enslaved African Americans in their communities, which of course also wasn't exactly the truth either, right? So despite the way that Bartram describes some of these individuals living alongside Cowkeeper, the way he emphasizes Cowkeeper's power, the way he emphasizes his dominance, right? Despite some of that perhaps being a little bit of, shall we say, editorial license, perhaps, or maybe him casting what he expected to see onto Cowkeeper's actions and the behavior of those in his retinue, it is true that Cowkeeper's martial exploits were an important part of his leadership. They were an important part of the place he made for himself in the area of the Alachua Prairie. Perhaps the best illustration of Cowkeeper's, another aspect that's important to Cowkeeper's appeal and his power, his political savvy, comes in his relationship with Governor James Grant. Thanks to a couple of years serving alongside Cherokee war parties during the French and Indian War, Grant really had built this idea of how he wanted to conduct native diplomacy. And he had this idea that he was going to come into Florida during his governorship and build a strong foundation of Indian relations. Cowkeeper puts this acumen that Grant believes he picked up during his service in wars further north to the test, because Cowkeeper is an incredibly savvy individual who knows how to negotiate. So in 1765, as we'll hear more about later, and as has already been alluded to, there is this Congress called the Piccolata Congress that's held at Piccolata, that Grant convenes alongside John Stuart to attempt to secure British land claims in East Florida, specifically. And he invites the Alachua's leaders, including Cowkeeper, along with several Micos from Chattahoochee River communities, right? So he's trying to basically pull in native leaders that are interested in Florida, right? That have some kind of stake in Florida, and to get their assent to the British colonial presence and to build a solid trading relationship with them. Cowkeeper, however, chose not to attend. And this is an important incident that happens in the documents, and it's repeated in the British colonial documentation that requires a little bit of reading between the lines. Because if you take everything at face value, Cowkeeper always has a plausible excuse for not showing up. The weather is bad, and he can't traverse the roads leading to St. Augustine. He's off hunting. There are various reasons he gives at various times as to why he's not coming into St. Augustine. And these are all plausible excuses. The Oconee people in Alachua and other, Muskogee people would have spent good parts of the year out hunting, right? The roads frequently were impassable, especially when there were heavy torrential rains. Florida during this time was very difficult to traverse. Infamously, the Camino Real was never really fully finished. Infamously, Grant himself has to hire indigenous runners to send messages west to Appalachia and to Pensacola. But Cowkeeper, if anyone knew how to traverse this terrain, it would have been him, right? So one is a little suspicious that the weather is impeding Cowkeeper as much as he claims that it is. It's also worth noting that at other times, when there aren't big congresses where other indigenous leaders are being invited, Cowkeeper shows up on time. It only seems to be when there are other leaders coming from other parts of the Creek domains that Cowkeeper mysteriously can't make it, right? So how do we choose to read this? Well, I argue that Cowkeeper is deliberately absenting himself in order to secure a one-on-one meeting with Grant, because he does this to Grant twice, and he does it to Grant's successor, Patrick Tonin, as well. So Cowkeeper doesn't show up at the Piccolata Congress. Instead, Long Warrior, who I'll talk about in a minute, is the one who attends the conference in his stead. But Grant knows that Cowkeeper is the most prominent figure in the community. So Grant reserves a set of gifts for Cowkeeper and waits for Cowkeeper to appear. Cowkeeper does a few weeks later, bringing with him over 60 attendants. And you can imagine some of the people that Bartram notes are along with Cowkeeper on this journey, right? Cowkeeper is coming in with this big retinue to show his prominence and his influence as an individual, right? There's a lot of pageantry in native diplomacy. And that really suits Grant just fine, because Grant loves pageantry too, So there's a meeting of the minds here. These two love all of the rituals associated. Now, there's deep cultural meanings to the rituals in Creek diplomacy. One might even say that the ritual is the important part of a Creek diplomatic treaty, right? The piece of paper, the document, that really is something that the Europeans put the primacy in. The rituals that enacted what was contained in that document were the most important part for indigenous leaders, and Cowkeeper would be no exception. So Cowkeeper claimed in this particular occasion in 1765 that the winter hunts was his excuse this time. And so he, basically says to Grant, sorry, I wasn't able to be here earlier. Whether Grant actually believes him or not is kind of beside the point. Grant clearly isn't all that upset about it. And in fact, Grant seems to love kind of having a one-on-one interaction and dialogue with Cowkeeper. So why was Cowkeeper so late, other than his desire to be one-on-one with Grant, right? To kind of stake his claim to being an important person. Well, the Alachua communities were really, in the Creek political world, right? Communities such as Coweta and Cuseta, further north on the Chattahoochee River, they were kind of been expected to have primacy in these big councils where multiple communities were engaging with British leaders. And you saw that in the descriptions of the Piccolata Conference, whereby several leaders deferred to a Micco from one of those Chattahoochee River towns, Talachea. Basically, every other Micco at the meeting defers to Talachea and says, we're going to let Brother Talachea speak. He speaks for all of us, right? And that's particularly a custom when it comes to smaller communities known as talofas, which were seen as, some scholars have described them as satellite towns. I don't know if I entirely like that word, but these were communities that had been less established in terms of their reputation. Oftentimes they were communities that were composed of groups that were kind of ethnic minorities within the Creek Coalition. And a lot of times in diplomatic councils, they were kind of expected to take a back seat. And that kind of helps explain why people like Cowkeeper often struck out on their own, attempted to relocate and to move to different areas. Sometimes they would move to the Flint River. Sometimes they would move further south on the Chattahoochee River into the Florida Panhandle, where the Chattahoochee basically begins and the Apalachicola River is starting, right? Or they move deeper south, like Cowkeeper did, into the prairies and the savannas of the Alachua region. A lot of these figures were seeking greater autonomy. They wanted to be able to act on their own, build their own relationships with outsiders, and they wanted to be able to conduct diplomatic dealings free of the influence and interference of these more prominent, more established communities, right? So I'm arguing what's happening here is the evidence is showing that Cowkeeper really kind of just wants to avoid these figures who might lean on him to go along with whatever they're pushing him to do, right? And especially in cases like this, where the British are looking to secure territorial cessions, right? These Chattahoochee River towns, by virtue of conquest, often tried to lay claim to Florida territory. And so a figure like Cowkeeper, who's living in the heart of this Florida territory, is actually, deeply rooted in this territory, is going to push back against that because they want the autonomy to negotiate relationships for themselves. They don't want to be dependent upon these people who are living several days travel away, who are purporting to essentially rule over them, right? So by staging a one-on-one relationship with Grant, Cowkeeper is essentially trying to take charge of his community's own destiny, right? He was very strategic as to how often he associated with those Chattahoochee River communities. He often claimed he'd not heard from them, and he had no idea what was going on up there. And there was this, delicate dance that was going on. He didn't want to openly confront or antagonize the Miccos and the communities up on the Chattahoochee River, but he also didn't want to have to defer to them. So he often said, I haven't heard anything from those people. I really am kind of separate from them. And this is the area in which a lot of scholars talk about, especially in previous generations, have debated the notion of Seminole ethnogenesis. Were these people still Creeks? Are they now Seminoles? And we've kind of, in the scholarly field, without going too far into the weeds, have kind of complicated that discussion even further, right? But Cowkeeper is engaged in this dance that gave rise to those questions, right? are we going to, how deeply connected are we with the Chattahoochee River towns? How often do we discuss things with them? To what extent are we managing our own affairs, right? And this meeting with Grant and this avoidance of the Piccolata Congress is part of that effort on Cowkeeper's part. And Cowkeeper basically comes to Grant. He spends several days with Grant. Grant feeds him, provides all this hospitality for Cowkeeper and his retinue. They both have a great time. And for Cowkeeper, this is recognition of his power. This is recognition of his status, right? To be hosted by the governor, to be given gifts by the governor, many of which served a symbolic or ritual purpose, some of which had a practical purpose, but all of which were crucially important for securing Cowkeeper's status as a leader. In communities like the Alachua communities, right? One secured leadership by securing access to goods and by redistributing those goods, right? One helped gain followers or secure one's status as a leader by being able to forge these ties with the outside world, and being able to bring in items that either symbolically enhance one's prestige or serve the needs of community members. So after the 8 days that Cowkeeper spends with Grant, he's given a large medal, a medallion. This was a colonial practice that was started by the French, but the British and the Spanish both picked up on it, where they gave these large medallions. Often they were emblazoned with like some kind of scene that depicted a meeting of European and Native societies. Sometimes they were depicted with the figure of a king, or in the United States case later, there were medals issued with George Washington's head on them that would denote a figure's recognition by an outside leader, a colonial leader in most cases, right? So this medal was essentially a sign that Cowkeeper was a prominent man, powerful man, right? And he also received a large supply of gifts and provisions. The following year, the same thing happens again. Cowkeeper calls on Grant by himself, and Cowkeeper lives with a large supply of goods. Now, the first year, Grant doesn't, or at least I haven't found the exact list of goods that he gave Cowkeeper, but the second visit in 1766, he does document exactly what he gave Cowkeeper. He gave him 2 kegs of gunpowder, ball in proportion, meaning musket balls that were proportionately equivalent to the amount of gunpowder he provided, 2 kegs of rum, a barrel of flour, 200 weight of rice, paint, tobacco, pipes, shirts, and what Grant referred to as trifles, such as rings and earrings. Now, it's important to note that these things were considered trifles by colonists, but these were important marks of endowment that also conveyed status and connections to the outside world for members of these indigenous communities. Grant was smitten with Cowkeeper, or at least his correspondence leads us to believe that. He raves about Cowkeeper after his departure, claiming that he was, quote, one of the most intelligent Indians I've ever met with. One could also view that as a bit of a backhanded compliment, kind of noting this colonial tendency to look down upon Native people. But regardless, Grant was impressed with at least Cowkeeper himself. And the two enjoyed a good relationship throughout the duration of Grant's governorship. Cowkeeper's political maneuverings continued with Grant's successor, as I alluded to earlier. In 1774, when Patrick Tonin takes the governorship after an interim period of various figures like Moultrie, Cowkeeper basically does the same thing he did to Grant when Grant arrived. Tonin calls in the people of Alachua, as well as people from the Chattahoochee River towns, to meet with him. Cowkeeper shows up 2 days late. Cowkeeper says, well, the rains swole and caused the roads to be impassable. We couldn't get here in time. That, despite the fact that people were traveling from much further away, traverse the same roads, the same bad weather, and get there before Cowkeeper does. Cowkeeper declines to attend another meeting with Tonin the following year. But in this case, Cowkeeper actually lets on as to what exactly is going on. He basically, or at least something he says to Tonin, a message he sends to Tonin, gives Tonin the impression that really what Cowkeeper is doing is trying to avoid being at the same meeting at the same time as these other Creek leaders are. Tonin says, Cowkeeper will come to me and will only come to me as soon as the Creeks are entirely gone. So the mask kind of slips off here a little bit. He's like, okay, I see what's going on here. Cowkeeper's trying to avoid being at a big conference with all these other figures. The selective attachment to the Chattahoochee River towns was evident in the way Cowkeeper referred to them, the way he continually referred to not really knowing what was going on there, as I mentioned earlier. But it's important to note that one of these times that he says that he has no idea what's going on with the Chattahoochee River people, and he has no idea what's going on to the north, he says this at the same time that he's hosting several people in his community from the Chattahoochee River towns. So he says he hasn't talked to these people and he hasn't heard from them, but they're there with him visiting at Alachua. And he brings some of them with him in 1764 when Grant's predecessors first arrive in Florida. People from the towns of Oconee, like Cowkeeper himself, but also from the towns of Chehaw, Palachicola, and Oswego. So this is the first time that Cowkeeper really engages with British officials during the first British period in Florida, the 1764 meeting. And he pledges at this meeting that he will remain loyal to the British, even if his nation, and in this case he's referring to the people of the Chattahoochee River, should behave otherwise. So here he's also kind of giving other indications to what's going on here, right? He is claiming ignorance as a way to distinguish himself from those people from those other communities. And he's making clear that if ever there's a falling out with, say, the people of like Coweta or Caseta or any of these other towns further north, Cowkeeper has nothing to do with it. And this happens repeatedly, right? Whenever there's violence between British colonists, particularly in Georgia, and members of these Chattahoochee River communities, Cowkeeper goes, yeah, you know what, that has nothing to do with us, right? And engages in discussions and rituals that attempt to reinforce peace, right? There's one particular incident where there are a series of murders, and Grant and Cowkeeper kind of hash it out, and Cowkeeper makes clear the people of Alachua have nothing to do with that, and we essentially want to maintain a peaceful coexistence of British colonists. That said, this relationship between Cowkeeper's people and the Chattahoochee River Creeks sometimes could work in Cowkeeper's favor if he wanted to stave off a colonial demand. And this particularly was the case when the American Revolution broke out, and Patrick Tonin was asking the Alachuas to send warriors to go fight alongside British troops in repelling any kind of American invasion, or even to go engage in offensive operations outside of Florida. Cowkeeper wasn't ready to totally commit right away. It's important to note that a lot of indigenous people are kind of bewildered about what's going on with the American Revolution at first, right? And they kind of tend to say, this is a fight between brothers, you know, you're all basically one and the same people. We don't want to really get involved in your factional dispute. For various people, that changes over time, and Cowkeeper is one of those people who gradually decides, I'm going to go basically hitch my wagon to the Tories and fight against Patriot forces. But at first, Cowkeeper says, you know what, we'd love to help you, but we are afraid of what the Creeks will do if we do that. And we don't want to get involved in this fight before talking to them first. And there's probably a kernel of truth in that, right? He doesn't want to commit to something that's going to anger those people up north. He doesn't want to bring their wrath upon him. And most importantly, he doesn't want to be caught in a situation, most likely, where he's forced to fight against warriors from those towns, right? So there's probably a kernel of truth there, but not that much truth. Because by 1776 and 1777, he is kind of full-throatedly jumping into this battle. He is helping repel Patriot attacks. He is launching raids into Georgia without prompting. And some Creek Micos are upset about this, and they complain that he hasn't have permission from them to go do this. So whatever happens in the intervening months propels Cowkeeper to decide, you know what, I am going to help the governor out. I'm going to help Tonin out. I'm going to fight against some of these Patriot militias. So by 1777, he's kind of fully committing to fighting alongside the British. There, in addition to his political exploits, there's also the matter of his very name, the Cowkeeper, right? One of his kind of visionary aspects was the extent to which he and his people adopted cattle ranching, which has become very deeply rooted in Florida Seminole culture over the intervening centuries, right? The ranching that took place in the Alachua Prairie became integral to the identity and the economy of Cowkeeper's people and their descendants. And this is largely thanks to the selection of the Alachua Prairie as their homeland. This is largely thanks to the innovations that Cowkeeper's generations of people conducted. They already well knew that the plains were home to large herds of feral cattle, and they knew this from the raids that they conducted earlier in the 18th century. This was a location of a large Spanish colonial era ranch, the Hacienda de Alachua, which translates roughly to the ranch of the sinkhole. It sounds like an appealing place. And here's a picture that I admittedly cribbed from Wikipedia of Payne's Prairie, but it kind of conveys the wide open spaces that were integral to why these cattle thrived there, right? Now, Hacienda de Alachua was pretty much a failure. It was a Spanish colonial enterprise that started in the 17th century. It went awry mostly because, for various reasons, but partly because of indigenous power, right? Spaniards could never really gain control of that region. Indigenous peoples of Florida basically prevented them from really building any sort of sustainable colonial enterprise that far inland. So basically the ranch goes into decline. Various raids by indigenous people break its connections with St. Augustine. Cattle are occasionally rustled from the area. It's very convenient if you are a person from Oconee conducting a raid on indigenous missions and indigenous communities in northern Florida to continue going down to the Alachua Prairie and feeding yourself on all this free beef that's just kind of out there waiting to be hunted, right? So Cowkeeper's people knew well the kind of large herds that were in this region. And once the Spanish kind of abandoned the ranch, the cattle basically proliferated and thrived on their own. And so basically Cowkeeper and his people adapted hunting practices to this large convenient population of cattle that were self-sustaining, right? They hunted these cattle initially the way they would other wild game, but over time eventually grew to become active ranchers. And there was a continuum here, right? They didn't just hunt the cattle and then one day become ranchers. There was a gradual process. There was like a continuum or a gradual transition from simply hunting cattle to actively managing the landscape to even further increase the herd sizes to actively raising the cattle yourselves, right? So Cowkeeper's generation was part of this transition, this taking of the landscape and massaging it into something that really became a staple part of their community. By the time the Bartrams came down and noticed this, and during the 1765 expedition of John and William, they marveled at the level green plain and the innumerable droves of cattle that they found there. But they were essentially late to the party. They found something that indigenous people had long known about, and they came into a landscape that Cowkeeper and his people were actively managing by that time and were essentially tailoring to continue being very productive. And that kind of gets at one of the myths a lot of times that people think about indigenous peoples, that they are essentially, they're ecologically sustainable in a lot of cases, but people often take that to mean that they are, not interfering with nature. And nothing could be further from the truth. They're actively managing nature in a sustainable way. And indigenous communities all throughout North America do this. They actively manage the landscape in a way that's both sustainable, but also helps produce the kind of food, crops, and resources that they need. Cowkeeper and his peers chose to harness these wild herds to support their permanent settlement. And so this really kind of helped the Tuscarora community flourish. The twin threats of British colonization and interference from the Chattahoochee River towns forced Cowkeeper and his people to take active defense of this land, though. Right? It wasn't as if this land was an oasis that wasn't under threat by outside forces, right? So Cowkeeper comes, and as we've already heard, the Oconees who come into Florida do build relationships with the existing indigenous peoples that are already here. And together they kind of build new societies, but they also are seeking to defend those societies from outsiders. Hence, these interactions with Grant aren't just an attempt for Cowkeeper to gain prominence, but they're also an effort by Cowkeeper to protect what he and his people have become stewards of. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is Cowkeeper's fate. He did not react well to the British defeat in the American Revolution, as it led to the empire's decision to cede Florida to the Spanish. He had spent decades building relationships with British colonial governors, and he had developed a fairly firm understanding by the standards of European colonists that the Alachua Prairie was off limits, right? And so part of this was Cowkeeper was probably worried that the Spanish were going to undo all of that work. And part of it was he had these strong diplomatic and trade relationships with people like Grant and Tonin that would be jeopardized by this whole new group of people coming in. It's also worth noting that Cowkeeper initially came to power by raiding Spanish communities and attacking their indigenous allies. So these are people that he had been enemies with for decades, and now suddenly, late in life, he was being asked to build a relationship with them out of the blue, after these British colonists had spent decades telling him to make war on the Spaniards. It was bewildering to him, and it was infuriating. And in 1784, he swears vengeance against the King of Britain in a burst of anger. He accuses them of betraying him and his people. He accuses them of giving away his land to incoming Spanish colonists. Several scholars have also claimed that Cowkeeper begged British officials to take him with them to exile. And as best as I can tell, the references behind these claims are a bit wonky. What I think is going on here, people like Kenneth Porter that wrote generations ago, there's a little bit of confusion because there are two officials who show up at St. Augustine, Finebones of Coweta and a man named Perryman who lives in a community on the Flint River. They say that they would wish to go and evacuate with British soldiers and go to whatever land the king has to receive them. And I think over time, somehow this kind of got corrupted to Cowkeeper requesting that he leave with the British. But in any case, there's no real evidence that Cowkeeper did so. The most contemporary source I can find referring to Cowkeeper wanting to leave with the British comes from a travelogue published by Johann David Schuff, a German traveler who is moving through the region. And he got several details wrong. He referred to Cowkeeper as the cow driver, and he called him a Cherokee. So he wasn't exactly a very great, reliable narrator here. So as best as I can tell, the idea that Cowkeeper was asking to leave with the British is a bit of a corruption of some legitimate sources based on some illegitimate sources. But at any rate, there's no evidence that even if he had asked to do this, that Cowkeeper actually left with time? Okay, sorry. Man, I went way overboard. Okay, there's no evidence that he actually left. So as best as we can tell, Cowkeeper died in the mid-1780s, right? As far back as 1774, Cowkeeper had said that he was an old man and almost the only one of his family living. So he was already elderly by the time the American Revolution started. By 1788, his nephew Payne is noted as the Micco of the Alachuas. And in 1786, a Micco from Little Tallahassee named Alexander McGillivray said that he knew little of the Florida people's leaders and that all the figures that he knew were already dead. So the most likely explanation is that by this time, Cowkeeper has already passed away, sometime between 1784 and 1786. And this is where I was going to talk about Long Warrior, but I rambled on way too long, so I didn't get to it. I'm sorry. Well, thank you.
We don't know much about indigo, but I do know it's processed often with human urine. Makes it especially noxious, right?
What were some staple crops that the Timucua people grew?
So it depends where, right? So the Timucuas live across most of Florida. So if you're on the coast, it's mostly they had what the French called fishing parks, which I love, right? They developed the technology to sort of have a wide range of marine resources, oysters, fish. If you go more interior, they probably started growing maize or corn a bit earlier. We know that on the coast, they don't adopt maize or corn until about 1450, and it's not for nutritional reasons. I've mentioned how sacred corn is, and it's probably part of that. So it really depends where, right? It's all across Florida. She's had her hand up a long time behind. I think she was the first to put her hand up. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just wondering if any of the modern people are interested, accepting, rejecting of DNA to tie themselves back to these earlier communities in Florida.
I partner with the Seminole Tribe of Florida on projects. I partner with Muskogee Nation. I've just, Miccosukee have just established a TIPO a year ago. So I'm starting, we actually just had a great meeting with them 2 weeks ago. I can't speak for them on DNA. I can tell you my personal scholarly opinion on DNA is that it's a dangerous, slippery road to go down. So indigenous nations are often conflated with indigenous heritage. So indigenous nations are sovereign political nations, much like the U.S. government. Our DNA is very diverse, right? Because we are a multinational polyglot nation. So too, we're indigenous nations always in the past. So Cherokee, Muskogee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, whoever you're looking at, that over thousands of years have been comprised of multilingual, multi-ethnic people. So there is no pure DNA, right? They are nations, not indigenous heritage. So those two things have to be kept very clear, and often we conflate them. So I have no idea if they're interested in DNA. I don't know how you would find Timucua DNA. Again, I think this would potentially assault their sovereignty. So one of the big things that happened in the early 90s, right, was the passage of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And as you know, in 2024, that was further strengthened. And the reason that NAGPRA was initially passed is because indigenous bodies have been stolen by the U.S. federal government for generations, especially in the sort of 1860s to 1890s. Legions of medical doctors were hired by our federal government to go out and take and steal indigenous bodies off of battlefields. And indigenous bodies remain the site of a lot of colonialism as they're dug up. And so those acts protect indigenous nations' sovereignty over their own ancestors. So that's entirely in their purview. I have no idea what they would say. I don't think it would be very helpful. They have narratives that go back hundreds of years that talk about their ancestors, and those are really strong evidence that the Timucua are among their ancestors. And that's what Bartram reminds us, right? To listen to indigenous people who are knowledge keepers and who know their own history, but who have been marginalized as part of colonialism out of our intellectual pursuits. So, so I hope that helps.
I have a question. We didn't get to the Long Warrior. Can you give us a couple of minutes of who he was and his relationship with Bartram, particularly in Palatka?
Yeah. So the interesting about Long Warrior is that the famous print lists him as the king of the Seminoles, and that's not entirely an accurate description. There was no such thing as a king in indigenous communities in Florida in the first place. Secondly, he was essentially what some colonial people would refer to as the second man, or like a head warrior in the communities. He always is, at least until Cowkeeper's death, is kind of tied at the hip with Cowkeeper, but Cowkeeper is kind of the more prominent figure in that relationship. What you see in Bartram about Long Warrior is Bartram observes a ritual preparation for war. Long Warrior is preparing to lead in his position as Tustanuke, or warrior of the community. He is preparing to lead Alachuas in a raid on Choctaw villages. And the Alachuas, as well as many other Creek peoples to the north, are kind of off and on at war with the Choctaws during this period. And Bartram, again, kind of leads in some of those tropes about Long Warrior, about his manly countenance, but also being kind of, this like battle-hardened warrior who can be vicious at times, right? And you see a lot of that in the incident where Bartram observes Long Warrior talking with McClatchy, the trader that accompanies him, where Long Warrior gets up and thunders and attempts to say he can harness the thunder and lightning and bring it down upon McClatchy. And that tells you a lot about Long Warrior, and it also, even though it reflects some of what Bartram was trying to convey, this kind of, terrible, like violent figure, right? It was a strategic display of aggression, right? And you could tell it was strategic because Long Warrior calms down almost immediately thereafter, right? He is attempting to use his power and this claim he had to power that was almost spiritual, or supernatural in nature. He was using that as an act of intimidation in a trade negotiation. And it reflects how Long Warrior expected this trading relationship as basically a byproduct, almost tribute from the British colonists, right? McClatchy was looking at trade negotiations as a deal. Long Warrior was looking at trade as something that was expected of the British in return for the Alachua people letting the British be on this land. So Long Warrior himself was a very savvy negotiator who made his name for himself as a warrior, like Cowkeeper had done decades earlier, but in time grew to be his own prominent political leader. So I'll leave it there.
And my other question is, we learned about the old trader, and we understand that it's Job Wiggins. And how did that all work out? Who is the old trader that Bartram talks about in Travels?
Are you referring to? You're not referring to McClatchy.
Well, we think it's Job Wiggins.
Okay.
So I didn't know if that's true or not, Catherine.
Two.
Yeah.
Are there two traders?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer to that question.
Okay.
To be perfectly honest, I am predominantly a scholar of indigenous Floridian.
Gotcha. Okay,
So-
no problem. Got it.
Yeah, so my knowledge of Bartram is probably far inferior to almost everyone in this room.
There's some questions over here.
In terms of the meeting or the continuous meetings that Cowkeeper found a reason not to attend, was there any reaction, or are there records of the reaction of the other indigenous leaders to him not showing up?
That's a really excellent question. Some of them do take note of his absence. They don't really say anything in particular to Grant or any of the other colonial officials present. Doubtless, there probably were discussions amongst themselves as to why Cowkeeper wasn't there. They probably had a suspicion as to what was going on, especially when you see a decade later when they kind of express anger that Cowkeeper is launching these raids, and they hadn't really given a say-so to do that. But they don't really let on to what's going on in their internal politics, their cross-community politics to the British colonial leaders. They're kind of very much focused on the trade negotiations. Yeah.
The leaders of Cahuilla and Casita assert with great vehemence that it is their land, and they are the ones who have the right to make the cession, not those people who are
That's true.
who are herding cattle down in Painesville. They do not have a right to negotiate that far. It's the headman on the Chattahoochee. It's their land.
These were such great talks. Thank you so much. My question is kind of a wild one, just a conjecture that I was wondering if you could share any thoughts about if we were looking for the indigenous name of the Franklinia. Wouldn't the Yamasee maybe be a key in that language if they came from there and moved before the Bartrams got there? They had moved south. Is that accurate?
I don't know much about Franklinia. No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, and in the Timucua corpus that I'm working in, we don't get that level of detail, right? It's Spanish Franciscans asking questions of Timucua people to try to transform them into Catholics through cultural genocide, and then also try to ensure that they're remaining good Catholics and they don't talk about.
It may have been like a cultivated crop, you know?
Yeah. It's not one of the ones that I've seen in anything I've worked in. But I'm sorry. But there are wonderful linguists out there. So there's a great upcoming linguist that's studying at UF right now, whose facility in moving between Muskogean dialects is remarkable. You know, I haven't seen anything like it. So maybe Ian could answer a question.
I have an easy question. Did Cowkeeper knew English or Spanish, or he rely on translators?
He mostly relied on translation, but I mean, he knew a little bit, right? Like he picked up a little bit of predominantly English, right, in his interactions with traders over the years. But
So when colonial settlers arrived, right, in the 16th and 17th centuries, what they discover, there are already appointed linguists in every indigenous community, and that Miccos or chiefs, who can be women as well as men, rely on these translators because they're already living in a very multilingual world. And so those translators become very, very skilled in English and Spanish as well. The Timucua, who I've just alluded to, there's a really interesting language project I mentioned. The Spanish say that the Timucua learned to write Spanish, coming from allegedly a non-literal, in 6 months. Mm-hmm. So they're already very skilled linguists whose professional jobs are to learn languages, and so they learn Spanish and English very rapidly. Okay, so on the other hand, the Spanish and British learn indigenous languages very slowly and poorly. Yes.
Last question.
Okay.
Were the Yamasee related linguistically to any other tribes that we can identify?
Yeah, so the Yamasee spoke Hichti, which is the ancestor of modern day Miccosukee, or Ilapongi, which is the language spoken by the Miccosukes today. And so it's a Muskogean language. It's related to, the languages that the Muskogee Creeks speak. And in fact, the Yamasee were part of the origins of the Muskogee Creek Nation, which I talk about in my book. They started creating that nation together in 1691. So yes, they speak the same language. They can speak to the Wales on the coast too, so they're Muskogean language speakers. Good question that I could answer. Sorry. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay.